Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today I want to give a theory-based answer to a very interesting question I was recently asked during a fencing class, which is, how fast do I think a real historical sword fight was back in the day? It's a very interesting topic and very pertinent to how we train and how we try to apply our arts. So let's analyze this step by step. Okay, so the first thing I want to discuss is a couple of ways in which you shouldn't try to measure the speed of an authentic sword fight. First of these is fictional or dramatic sword fights in TV shows and films. These fights are carefully choreographed and shot in order to tell a story. So they're not a realistic portrayal of combat. Even if the techniques the combatants are using can be loosely based on historical ones, the tricks of cinematography make it invalid as a way of trying to measure a sword fight. I'm saying this because many of us, either consciously or subconsciously, have pictures of cool movies or cool TV shows in our heads when we think about fencing with swords. That's fine, but we need to kind of separate those from the reality of studying and practicing and applying a martial art. So that's the first thing. The second thing is modern sports fencing, Olympic style fencing. This sport has the reputation of being the fastest sport in the world in terms of the reflexes of the athletes. I have no idea if that's literally true or not, but it's certainly true that sports fencing is very fast. Does that mean that historical fencing styles were equally fast? No. Modern sports fencing is a sport. In other words, it's a type of game. They're not using real weapons. They're trying to score points rather than kill somebody. There's no threat to their lives. There are all these extra circumstances that mean it's really not an authentic sword fight. We can't use that as a benchmark to try to measure how real warriors would have moved back in the day. So, in conclusion to this section, try to forget modern sports fencing, try to forget dramatic sword fights on TV or at the cinema. These things are not real sword fights. Okay, so let's talk about period fencing treatises. What did the fencing masters say about how we should move and how fast we should go in a real sword fight? There aren't any treatises that I know of that spell it out explicitly for us. Why should they? I mean, the fencers that they were teaching, the audience that they were trying to reach back in the day knew what a real sword fight was because they could see it around them. They would have to participate in them. So instead of just looking for one obvious description of the speed of a sword fight, we need to try to sift through the text to look for little clues here and there to build up an overall picture of the fight. And having looked at a number of 16th and 17th century Italian treatises, I have found some interesting things. If we think about the attacks or the movements with the sword, it's pretty clear that these should definitely be fast. I'm going to try and find a relevant quote from Di Grassi's treatise, first of all. Okay, so when he's talking about making attacks, he says you should strive as much as you can to attack or parry not in 2 times with 2 motions, but rather in half a time and motion if possible. So in other words, your attacks and parries must be as fast as you can make them. And he repeats this advice at various points in his book in various different ways. For example, when he talks about making ripostes, he says you should always try to make the fastest possible riposte. even if it means the riposte is less powerful and does less damage to the opponent. So he is actually really focused on being very fast with parries, with attacks, and with ripostes. And you can find similar language in other fencing treatises. So for example, in Rodolfo Capoferro's book, he uses some quite strong words to describe the attack. He talks about making them as quick and as strong as possible. He talks about attacks being vigorous. He talks about unleashing attacks on the opponent. So these are all very strong adjectives to use. So basically the attacks and the parries should be very fast. But we should also consider how the fencer themselves move, so the footwork and the body movements. And the language we see associated with footwork and body movements is actually quite different. So if we go back to Di Grassi, which is my usual primary source, what does he say about footwork? He talks about taking the greatest care when you take steps. He says, always have one foot planted and stable, move it with very sound reasoning. It needs to correspond with what your hand's doing, etc., etc. So, stable and sound reasoning. These words conjure an image of caution. And if we cross-reference with Rodolfo Capoferro's treatise, what does he have to say about it? Well, he says in his chapter about seeking measure, so trying to close in on the opponent to make a strike, you need to exercise patience until you are in the aforementioned distance. Do not move to strike before then. So that's quite interesting. And then another relevant quote from Capoferro is simply this one. In the wide measure, tempo requires patience. In the narrow measure, it requires speed, both in striking and in recovering. And this last quote from Capoferro is really the key one for me in answering the question, how fast is a sword fight? So for me, a sword fight is actually slow and cautious when you're far away from your opponent. You're trying to ease in, looking for angles, looking for the right timing, trying to provoke an opening in your opponent's defense. But it's cautious because you need to stay safe. And you can only afford to make an attack when there's a genuine opening or a genuine tempo, a genuine opportunity to make the attack. When there is an opening at relatively close distance, then you switch to the dynamic movement, to being as fast as possible. And then, of course, you need to recover as fast as possible, as we already heard. And these things in turn mean that when we are defending, we need to make our parries as fast as possible. This dichotomy between the movement and the striking or parrying can be seen in other fencing treatises as well, or at least it can be hinted at. So whenever other fencing masters of the era talk about moving or taking footsteps, they use words like graceful, calm, poised, moving with careful reasoning or sound judgment, all these kinds of things. And then the attacks are usually described as being fast or vigorous or things like this. So, what does that mean overall? Well, to answer the original question, I think an original sword fight, a period sword fight, was sometimes slow and sometimes fast. I think the fencers moved slowly and cautiously until they saw an opportunity, and then they tried to strike as quickly as possible and then get back to safety. So that's what I take from the treatises. Okay, so what does all this mean from a practical point of view for how we train in historical fencing? I think there are a couple of points that you should take away from this discussion. Firstly, a lot of fencers try to move as fast, as quickly, and as powerfully as possible right from the start of an exchange. And I think this is wrong. If you're at wide measure, if you're just starting the fight, you should be really cautious. You can't just throw a big attack in as fast as you can and hope for the best. You need to have patience. You need to move carefully with reason and judgment to make an opening. And only when you see an opening at an appropriate measure do you then launch a fast attack. So, in other words, when you're free fencing, be patient, work for the attack. Don't move fast to start with, be cautious. So that's the first point. The second point is a lot of fencers' wishes in a fight, shall we say, often exceed their level of skill or their level of ability to control their weapon and to control the situation. So the adrenaline gets going, they feel like they're in a sword fight and they want to take the other person out, and they start moving very fast or trying to move very fast. And very often this means that they lose control of their weapon or lose control of their posture or measure or other aspects of the fight. Control is extremely important and is emphasized very strongly in basically every fencing treatise. So my advice to you is, when you are training in the salle, start off slow. Build up speed until you reach the maximum speed where you can clearly control your weapon, and that's the speed you should fence at. Now, the maximum speed that you can control your weapon will hopefully increase over time. As you develop a better conditioning, as you develop a deeper understanding of the system, as you develop a better sense of judgment about when you can or when you shouldn't make attacks. So all of these things need to be developed slowly, step by step over time. Don't try to go too fast too soon. In other words, don't try to run before you've learned how to walk. Too many fencers fall into the trap of trying to go too fast. So slow and cautious at first and build things up over time. So that's my advice. That's the conclusion of the video. I hope this has given you something interesting to go away and think about. So yeah, that's the end for today. Take care, everyone. Bye.